It was a sweltering evening on July 16, 2019, in the quiet suburb of Springfield, Missouri, where American flags fluttered gently from porch railings and cicadas hummed under a molten dusk. Inside a modest colonial-style home at 414 Sycamore Lane, the usual group of congregants gathered for the weekly Bible study, led, as always, by 39-year-old Joel Emery, devout husband, HVAC technician, and respected deacon at Grace Revival Church. As hands clasped and scripture was read aloud in a circle of pious camaraderie, no one could have imagined that just beneath their feet, buried in the crawl space beneath the laundry room, lay the decomposing body of Joel's wife, Rachel Emery, 36 years old, missing for over 2 weeks but still unreported by the very man now reciting Romans with unsettling calm. This was not a crime that exploded into public consciousness with sirens and police tape. It simmered slowly, almost invisibly, concealed beneath layers of spiritual authority, marital routine, and cultivated image. Joel had been part of the community for nearly 2 decades. Born in nearby Branson in 1980, baptized at 14, and known by neighbors as private, even stoic, but always polite and ready to lend a hand, especially when it came to church maintenance. His wife, Rachel, by contrast, was described as warm but increasingly anxious in her final year. She had left her job as a 3rd-grade teacher at Fairmount Elementary in 2017, citing stress, but privately confided to close friends that her marriage had become cold, stifling, and that Joel wasn't the man she married anymore. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Rachel had dropped several subtle but chilling hints to her best friend, Melissa Coates, and her sister, Lindsay Adams, comments like, "I think he's hiding something," and "I don't feel safe in my own home anymore." Those remarks, initially brushed off as the words of a woman under strain, would later take on the weight of a dire warning. And yet, nothing about Joel's demeanor publicly shifted. If anything, he became more engaged, smiling during sermons, resuming his weekly scripture circles, and, when asked about Rachel's sudden absence, calmly explaining that she had gone to visit her sister in St. Louis to clear her head. But that statement quickly began to unravel. Not only did Rachel not take a bus or train anywhere near St. Louis, but her sister Lindsay had been living in Denver for over 6 months and hadn't spoken to Rachel since a brief phone call in late June. On July 2nd, just 1 day after what investigators would later determine to be Rachel's last confirmed sighting, she failed to show up for a standing hair appointment with stylist Dana Whitaker. That same evening, she ignored messages from Melissa, who reached out repeatedly, texts that went unanswered until the following day, when Melissa received a message from Rachel's number saying she was taking a break from everything. It didn't sound like her. The phrasing was too clipped, too generic. Later forensic analysis of Rachel's phone would confirm what Melissa had instinctively felt. That message had been sent by Joel, in an early attempt to construct the illusion of voluntary disappearance. Just 3 days after that, Joel posted a Bible verse to Facebook, Luke 8 verse 17. "For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest." A detail investigators would later seize upon not as evidence, but as eerie foreshadowing of what he already knew lay beneath his home. He even resumed Bible study the following Monday, July 8th, where he told attendees Rachel had extended her trip. One guest later said she thought it was odd that Joel never offered to call her on speakerphone or even pray for her directly during the gathering, as he often did when members were struggling. What no one realized then was that Joel had already laid the groundwork for a prolonged deception, one that relied on his community's trust, his wife's silence, and a growing belief that Rachel had simply chosen to disappear. But cracks in that narrative would begin to widen. Melissa, refusing to let her instincts be dismissed, filed a missing persons report on July 10th. Joel played cooperative. He spoke to police calmly, told them about an argument, said Rachel had packed a bag and left in the night, that she was probably staying with someone in St. Louis, maybe a friend or distant cousin. He couldn't give a name. He couldn't provide a bus ticket or an address. And most damningly, Rachel's phone had ceased all activity the night of July 1st at exactly 11:13 p.m., its final ping located within their own property. Over the following week, the facade Joel had carefully constructed began to erode under scrutiny. The image of a God-fearing husband was no longer enough to silence the questions. Friends and family pushed harder. Police returned with cadaver dogs, And while Joel continued to host Bible studies, reading verses aloud in the very space where his wife's body lay buried beneath rotting insulation and plastic tarp, what remained of the truth was inching closer to daylight, just as he had unknowingly quoted from Scripture. What was hidden was about to be revealed. By July 10th, the missing persons report filed by Melissa Coates had set in motion a quiet but intensifying police investigation that began peeling away at the version of events Joel Emery had so carefully constructed. Detectives from the Springfield Police Department's Violent Crimes Unit initiated background interviews with neighbors, colleagues, and church members, and what emerged was a growing sense of discrepancy. A husband who showed concern but lacked urgency. A wife who had confided in multiple people that she feared something was deeply wrong at home, and a timeline that was already beginning to collapse under its own weight. Rachel Emery had not made any bank withdrawals since June 30th. Her credit cards sat untouched. There were no signs of travel, no social media activity, and no contact with friends or family, highly out of character for a woman described by her loved ones as always connected. Someone who never went more than a day without checking in. When police visited the Emery home on July 12th, Joel allowed them inside and maintained the same calm demeanor that had unnerved Melissa the week prior. He showed them a half-packed suitcase in the bedroom closet and insisted Rachel had taken the other one when she left. But that suitcase, when later recovered, would contain a mix of neatly folded clothes, toiletries, and a birth certificate. All items Rachel's sister confirmed she never would have traveled without. The officers noted an oddly strong air freshener scent in the house, concentrated in the hallway near the laundry room vent. Joel dismissed it as the HVAC kicking up some mildew from the vents, an excuse that might have passed if it weren't for a separate tip that came in the very next day. It was from Carla Bledsoe, a 34-year-old member of Grace Revival Church, and her name had already surfaced in a few conversations with congregants who noticed how frequently she lingered near Joel after services. Carla told detectives that while she hadn't spoken with Joel in a couple weeks, she felt guilty about not coming forward sooner. Under questioning, she admitted they had been involved in a relationship since early April, though she described it as spiritual and emotional and claimed it never crossed physical boundaries. Her phone was voluntarily turned over, and what it revealed contradicted her initial statements. Hundreds of messages had been deleted, most unrecoverable, but among the fragments retrieved were damning phrases. "She's not going to let this go," "Don't worry, I've taken care of it," and most chillingly, one sent at 3:27 a.m. on July 2nd that read simply, "It's done." When presented with this information on July 14th, Joel denied everything. He called the messages out of context and said Carla was trying to protect herself. But detectives were no longer interested in his explanations. They were now looking for physical evidence. That same day, they secured a warrant to search the Emery home a second time, this time with a cadaver dog. The search was conducted late in the evening on July 18th. Officers and forensic personnel methodically combed through the house, and it didn't take long for the dog to alert, repeatedly, near the vent just outside the laundry room, a location directly adjacent to the crawl space entrance. It was Stephen Hobart, a visiting Bible study attendee and HVAC apprentice who had first noticed the smell during the July 16th gathering, commenting quietly to another guest that it smelled like something had died under the house. The observation had been shrugged off at the time, as Joel gave a quick explanation about a trapped opossum. Now, that offhand comment became the crack that finally let in the flood. Investigators accessed the crawl space with floodlights and protective gear. At approximately 9:43 p.m., after removing a layer of plywood and loose insulation, they unearthed a shallow grave. Inside, wrapped in layers of painter's plastic, duct tape, and an old quilt Rachel's sister later recognized as a family heirloom, was the badly decomposed body of Rachel Emery. The autopsy would later confirm blunt force trauma to the skull as the cause of death, along with defensive wounds on her forearms that indicated a struggle. Blood spatter, trace carpet fibers, and bone fragments found in the couple's master bedroom would later match the scene investigators believe was the site of the killing. The timeline, reconstructed from digital forensics, security footage from nearby traffic cams, and Joel's own work logs, pointed squarely to the late evening of July 1st. Phone activity on Rachel's device ceased just after 11 p.m. Joel, who typically clocked into work at 6:30 a.m., called in sick the following morning for the first time in over a year. In that silence, in that unseen space beneath the floorboards where scripture had been read and coffee had been poured for weeks, lay a secret too heavy to stay buried. Joel Emery, who had stood at the head of a circle of prayer just 2 days before the discovery, was arrested at his home the following morning on July 19th. Police arrived during the opening prayer of that week's Bible study and led him out in handcuffs as stunned attendees looked on in confusion. Rachel had been underfoot the entire time. The questions now turned to why, and what else Joel had buried beneath his mask of godliness. In the days that followed Joel Emery's arrest, the community of Grace Revival Church, and indeed the entire suburb of Springfield, reeled from the seismic rupture of the image they had clung to, a man of scripture, family, and service now unmasked as a calculating killer. As the investigation deepened, so did the complexity of the psychological portrait emerging from both testimony and tangible evidence. Joel refused to speak to police beyond the initial denial, invoking his right to counsel almost immediately after his arrest on July 19th. But the narrative constructed by investigators did not rely on confession. It was built brick by brick from the patterns of deception he had laid out so meticulously. Forensic examiners confirmed Rachel had been killed sometime between 10:45 and 11:15 p.m. on July 1st, based on the cessation of data transmission from her phone, interrupted communication with Melissa, and security footage from a neighbor's Ring camera that caught muffled shouting, unintelligible, but unmistakably frantic, echoing through the otherwise quiet night. Digital analysts recovered recently deleted search histories from Joel's tablet and work laptop, including disturbing queries such as, "How long does a body smell after death? Can you bury someone in your own home?" and "Missing person without report suspicious." In court filings, prosecutors would later argue that the killing was premeditated, triggered not by a singular moment of rage but by a calculated belief that Joel could construct an entirely new life, possibly with Carla Bledsoe, whose involvement remained under a separate investigation but did not result in immediate charges. Carla's messages, while incriminating in tone, were not explicit enough to prove conspiracy beyond reasonable doubt, though she was issued a subpoena and would later testify under immunity in a grand jury proceeding. During Joel's arraignment on July 22nd, the courtroom overflowed with media and community members, many of whom had sat shoulder to shoulder with him just weeks earlier, reciting psalms above the very space where Rachel's body had decayed. Prosecutors charged Joel with first-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice, citing his deliberate manipulation of text messages, his concealment of the body, and his false statements to police. His defense attorney, Robert Lansing, entered a plea of not guilty and attempted to cast doubt on the timeline, suggesting an alternative theory that Rachel may have died accidentally during a domestic altercation. But the weight of the forensic evidence, particularly the deliberate burial, the blunt force injuries inconsistent with a fall, and the digital footprint of his post-mortem behavior, undermined every aspect of the defense strategy. At trial in early March 2020, the prosecution introduced not only the physical evidence, but also the emotional testimony of Rachel's sister, Lindsay, and best friend, Melissa, who both recounted Rachel's growing sense of dread and her fear that Joel was losing his grip. The defense attempted to paint Rachel as unstable, referencing her departure from teaching and a short-lived prescription for anxiety in 2018, but the jury remained unmoved. After 8 days of testimony and 4 hours of deliberation, the verdict returned, guilty on all counts. Joel Emery was sentenced on April 3, 2020, to life without parole. Judge Ellen McPherson, in delivering the sentence, remarked that Joel's profound moral duplicity, leading prayer over a grave of his own creation, defied comprehension. In the months that followed, Grace Revival Church dissolved entirely, its congregation fractured by grief and betrayal. The Emery House at 414 Sycamore Lane was eventually sold at auction, the crawl space permanently sealed by the new owners. Rachel's family held a memorial service in Denver, where her ashes were scattered in City Park, a quiet, verdant space she had once visited with her sister and spoken of fondly in emails. What remains most chilling to those who knew her is not only the brutality of the act, but the quiet in which it was committed. For 17 days, a man led scripture readings and offered spiritual guidance while his wife lay buried beneath him, cloaked in silence and insulation. To this day, the question that lingers, haunting, unresolved, is whether the community truly never saw the darkness in Joel Emery, or whether they chose not to look until it was too late.